try to speak as little as possible because I think they should take most of the time. I'll do a quick introduction, however, of both of you. So, Joana Moll is an artist based in Barcelona. She's currently a resident at Hangar, but her practice is tied also to Berlin, to Basel. Her work explores the way techno-capitalist narratives affect the alphabetization of machines, humans, and ecosystems. Her main research topics include internet materiality, surveillance, social profiling, and interfaces. She's presented her work in institutions, museums, universities, festivals all around the world. She was the co-founder of the Critical Interface Politics Research Group at Hangar. She's currently a visiting lecturer at Elisava in Barcelona, an artistic researcher in residence at the Critical Media Lab at the Basel Academy of Art and Design, and a former research fellow at the BBVA Foundation and the Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin. And Matthew Fuller works on art, science, politics, and aesthetics. He's known, among, of course, many other things, for his writing on media theory and his important role, the role he played in software studies and their development. He's professor of cultural studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, and part of the editorial collective of Computational Culture, a journal of software studies. His books include How to Sleep, The Art, Biology, and Culture of Unconsciousness, How to Be a Gig, Essays on the Culture of Software, with Olga Guryunova, Bleak Joys, Aesthetics of Ecology and Impossibility, and with Eyal Weizman, Investigative Aesthetics, Conflicts and Comments in the Politics of Truth. So in order to frame what this conversation is going to cover, I don't know, I can't predict where it's going to go, so I won't disclose the aim, but I can share some of the gearing ideas that were there to reunite us and wanna talk about a series of things. I think we share in our different areas of work, whether it's artistic, academic, research, or institutional work, a certain doubt, a concern, reluctance with regards to comfortably inscribe our practices within what is called digital art. I think that would be a starting ground. I think it's whether too small or too big as a category. Connected to that, I think we all share a concern with how categories function, how they become functional, and a sort of meta gaze on how practices, artistic practices, start becoming or start functioning in compartments. And then the last shared trait would be something that, for lack of a better name, we called the unspectacular, but it's also maybe the nerdy, or the addressing somehow the opaque or the shadow implications of something, the shadowed implications of the digital as a technology. And so working at that level sometimes might involve a little bit the opposite to having a huge impact, because you're working on very technical and dry, gray stuff sometimes. And the paradox is that those layers, those infrastructures have a huge impact. And sometimes looking into that involves manners, grammars, modes of speaking, books you write that are not necessarily so spectacular. So it's an interesting relationship to impact. And I would like to start by asking them, Joana and Matthew, to provide a couple of projects that can give a sense of how they enter this conversation, what's their background, and to get a little bit of detail on how you work.
Okay, should we, yeah? Should I get to it since my presentation is here? Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here after the coffee break. Oh, appreciate it. So, Anna, thanks a lot also for the very kind introduction. I'm going to talk about quickly as a kind of about two projects that I think that define my practice very well. I've been dealing critically with internet infrastructures for quite some years now, and I tackle them from very different perspectives, from the surveillance, corporate surveillance part, from commercialization of data, from the materiality of these networks, and so on. So this project is called the Dating Brokers. I did it in 2018. Why is this not working? Ah. Thank you. So in a nutshell, this project started when I bought 1 million dating profiles online in 2019. I paid 136 euros. The way I could buy these profiles was incredibly easy and accessible, and I also could pay it through my PayPal account, which was quite ridiculous, I might say. And the data set, well, I bought it from this dating site. This doesn't exist anymore, but yeah, I mean, there is a lot of dating site business that they just sell profiles and data at large. Then I understood that it was as easy because it's something critical inside the online dating industry to just exchange profiles constantly. So there is like this massive trading of profiles that at the end, there is people behind them. They're just being exchanged wildly throughout the network. So even if you have a profile in Tinder, you might find yourself having a profile of petsanddogsdating.com. Yeah, for example, and that's not a joke. I mean, I found some cases like that. So as you can see, like this, the database of the prices and offers that I had. This was like 50% off offer when I bought it. But you see, there is all these categories like Thailand male and female profiles for $98 US, Thailand male profiles 35. Also, the prices were quite random, I would say. That's what I thought that digging into it was worth it because it was really wild indeed. That's like some of the examples of the data set that I purchased. It includes more than 600,000 males and almost half of the females. And every profile came with very thorough information on the user. Yeah, every profile came with 5 pictures, so I downloaded more than 5 million pictures, and with very thorough description of everybody. Yeah, when we have to understand that when we give out information in online dating apps, because the purpose is to find love or find sex or whatever, the level of detail that we are exposed to is much more than all the information we would give out on Twitter, for example, even Facebook. Yeah, so that's particularly critical that those profiles are just navigating the internet and different platforms and companies without any legal restriction whatsoever. Then I did the analysis. I sort of did like a reverse engineering, which basically means that I tried to understand where these profiles came from because the company I bought them from could not disclose this. And I found out that they came from Plenty of Fish. Plenty of Fish is an American-based company, originally Canadian, but one of the biggest online dating business, just after Match and Tinder back then in 2017, which is when I did the research. They claim to have more than 55 million users, so to say, just so we talk about numbers. But it was not about that. So for me, the more interesting thing, it was also to understand, okay, if they were capitalizing these profiles, who else did profit from these profiles that I bought? So that's when I did, like, again, reverse engineering research, which led me to Match Group. Plenty of Fish was part of Match Group, which is like the biggest online dating industry up to date. They own Tinder, now not anymore, but they own Tinder, Match, Mythic Press, Plenty of Fish, and many other major companies. And when I read to the privacy policy of Match, they clearly stated that any profile or any data generated in any of their platforms could be shared with other platforms or services owned by this company. It means that once you have a profile at Tinder, you just totally lose control of your profile. And what I said before, you don't know where it's going to end. And that's legal. Yeah? But the whole thing didn't end up here. So Match.com, Match Group is also part of Interactive Corp, which is a major internet company, which also, again, owns massive amounts of different services, like Vimeo, for example, The Daily Beast, and many, many others. And the privacy policy of this company is also stated exactly the same. any data generated in any of our services can be shared across many of these other services. That it was actually quite hard to map, which I managed to map, but I'm sure I missed some of them. So overall, I mapped more than 700 companies and services that could capitalize on any of the profiles that I purchased, but also any of the profiles created in any of these platforms. Yeah? And this transaction of data is highly invisible generally, and that's why I thought it was mandatory to, or at least very interesting to bring it out there. So the piece, because I'm still an artist, even though it goes between art and research, it's an online auction that it's still running online. So there is like, I'm just doing auctions of profiles from people. Yeah, and of course nobody can purchase anything. Yeah, but it was sort of to exemplify this wild transaction of data without any restriction online. So I thought that this was the best way to have this impression, that that's really what's happening. Yeah, and even this is much more lame than what it actually happens. So yeah, that's one of the projects. Also for this project, the first time that it's something that I'm doing quite regularly now, but I did this online report. So to broadcast, to highlight all the major findings of the investigation. So also other people could just follow up. This I know that has been used for advocacy groups that deal with privacy and so on. So some of the data that I found out here, it's been replicated and used for further research, which I really appreciate this, because I think that's also an important part of it. It's just not about the artwork, but to disclose all the research that made this possible, and that it can be used for civil suits or to influence policy or whatever, even just for research or education. And then this is a much more recent work. I premiered this in Berlin in January for Transmediale. It was a co-production between Transmediale and the Institute Ramon Llull, which I think somebody was here, Xavi, yeah, that he made it possible over there. And this is Tempelhof. It was an opera that was enacted at Tempelhof in February. It was very cold, but a lot of people came, and happily there was a lot of sun. So this project talks about okay, I need to go a little bit back to explain this. Because one of my biggest topics is also to understand this relationship between technology and nature. It's quite cannibalistic, I would say. So I'm exploring like how this process sort of break this balance, or given balance, or whatever we can call it. So in 2020, the anthropogenic mass surpassed the weight of the anthropogenic mass, that basically it's all human-made objects that we produce since mostly 1900, surpassed the weight of the biomass of the planet. Yeah, biomass, I explain it here. Biomass refers to the mass of living organisms, including plants, animals, microorganisms, and anything that is organic, let's say. Why anthropogenic mass? It's defined as the mass embedded in solid inanimate human objects. It's divided in 6 groups, which is concrete, bricks, asphalt, metals, and aggregates, and other materials. Yeah, so I found this study that was published in Nature in 2020, where they said that in 2020, like this group surpassed the weight of the organic living biomass on the Earth, and that's quite critical. I think it's just like another step, in the ladder. I mean, towards like total collapse or what's going to happen. But I felt like it was very graphic. Yeah, it was like a moment, something that there was a lot of material for not just educational material, but also something that could enact something else. That's why I did a project. So anyway, so whereas the amount of anthropogenic mass increased in the 1900s, I mean exponentially, the production of anthropogenic mass differed depending on political events, stuff that happened, World War I, Great Depression, oil crisis. For example, until 1924, there was no asphalt in the world. And after 1924, like the curve just went up very, very fast. Yeah. So those things, I thought they were interesting. So what I did, that's like the curves of concrete, the curves of brick throughout the years, the asphalt, as I said, right? There was like this huge peak in 1920, 1930s, and then that's it, like the production of asphalt decreased a lot, which I think is also very interesting. So what we did was to sonify all these curves to create an opera, which was activated by a phone. So the thing is, like, we created because Transmediale offered Tempelhof in Berlin. Tempelhof in Berlin, for the ones who are not familiar with it, it's this massive airport in the middle of the city. So we took one of the airstrips that it's about 2 kilometers long. And with this app, you could just hear the whole opera. But the whole opera was like an enacted timeline with your own body. So you would start at 1900 and you would finish at 2020. And you would just understand the fluctuations of the production of anthropogenic mass throughout these 2 kilometers. Yeah. Also, in order, we produced a libretto for the project, which also linked like all these fluctuations in the production of anthropogenic mass to stuff or particular thing that happened. For example, in 1904, the first teddy bear was produced, yeah, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. That's a project that I showed this picture, but that's what we did. So the day of the sort of the premiere, it was Saturday morning. It was very cold, but still like more than 100 people show up. So it was very, very nice. And I live it here, so like so we get a.
Great, thanks. So thanks to Anna and Joanna for this, great, really interesting opportunity to discuss. We've been asked to kind of position ourselves in terms of what we've done, what our work is. So I should say that around the kind of mid-1990s, I was involved with a number of different artist groups that were primarily working in the digital field, and from then onwards. So one group was called IOD, which was a group that produced interactive publications distributed by the net and distributed on floppy disks. This group produced a series of publications that were interactive, and they gradually moved from being interactive multimedia publications influenced by zine culture into the production of software. So the last pieces of work we did were fully fledged pieces of software rather than interactive publications that presented text or images or interactive processes. So one of the key works we produced was a project called the Web Stalker, which was an alternative browser. So this was a project that took apart the notion of the Web Stalker of the web browser as it was consolidating in the later part of the 1990s, and tried to place in the hands of the user a piece of software that was usually the remit of search engines. So the crawl function within the search engine, that is the function that looks for websites or web pages connected to the web page you're looking at, we placed in the hands of the user. So this created a more powerful piece of software than the normal browser that was predicated on reception and kind of a more passive version of use. We wanted to make software that was more active and gave people a slightly more kind of scavenger-like or predatory approach to navigation. Another group I was involved in at this period was a group called Mongrel, which was specifically an artist group that engaged with questions of race in relationship to digital media. So the participants in the group, Matsuko Yokokoji, Graham Harwood, Richard Pierre Davis, Mervyn Jarman, came from different backgrounds, from the Caribbean, Jamaica and Trinidad specifically, Japan, but also were engaged in the kind of explosion of activity in London street culture in relationship to music, different kinds of kind of popular activities, let's put it that way. And a lot of what we did was to try and look at how racial formations were configuring digital culture. So for instance, when Mervyn or Richard would come into an institution like Makbar or MoMA in New York to do a talk, they would often be sitting in a room like this, waiting for the curator to come and meet them. and they would be understood often, usually be understood to be the cleaner. They wouldn't be understood to be the artist. So they would be asked to leave the room quite frequently. So what we did was try and think, okay, within this context of a kind of heavily racialized art organization or art system, what opportunities does digital media open up for artists to rework the condition? So we produce many installations, but we also produce pieces of software. So one of the pieces of software that's produced was called Heritage Gold. And this was a hack of Photoshop. So we took a piece of software that's used for developing photographs, the industry standard, at that point, and used another piece of developer software to edit the processing and the text in Photoshop, so that it would be about rework Photoshop to make it about the way in which the idea of perfection, or the idea of beauty, or the idea of smoothness, and the idea of certain kind of filtering in software and in visual culture more broadly as it becomes digital, involves certain kind of ideas of beauty and the formation of the perfect, which are often indexed to ideas of race, class, and so on. So we kind of reworked this software. Another thing we did was to rework Google, which at that point, which is late 90s, 2000, was a lot more open as a technology. One could reverse engineer it in certain ways and feed data into it, but also sit on top of it and utilize it in certain ways. This project was to produce a search engine called Natural Selection, which anticipated a lot of the debates around the production of extremes in digital culture, and the production of extremes through the training of machine learning algorithms that tend to like high contrast. So these are the kinds of projects that I've kind of continued to be involved in. As part of this work, a lot of what I did was to theorize it, so to think about what is the kind of critical languages, what are the kind of conceptual formations that are necessary in order to discuss this work and to understand the way in which aesthetics as a broader field is changing in relationship to the digital and the things that the digital brings together. So a lot of my work since that period has also been writing critically. Also, it's cheaper to be a theorist than it is to be an artist, so that's a plus. So, writing ideas generally tends to fit within my budget pretty well. So that's the books that Anna's kindly mentioned are part of this kind of long-term series of work that look at aesthetics of software, aesthetics of the digital, thinking about the computational as not something we observe, as something we're external to and that produces vivid visual effects, but there's also something we inhabit. So in the kind of spaces we exist now, whether they're the kind of intimate spaces of the body in relationship to tracking software, in relationship to the formation of cities as spaces that are being made safe for automated vehicles, for instance, or in the planning software that generates architecture and urban formations. We're inhabiting digital spaces, we're inhabiting cultural processes, and we need to develop a critical and aesthetic vocabulary that allows us to think about the nuanced differences between different kinds of digital structure and their implicit politics, their implicit ways of sensing, knowing, seeing, and doing in the world, and the way they structure our experiences as persons, individuate us as subjects, but also act as the grounds in which we constitute ourselves as a society. Okay,
thank you so much to both. I think from everything you said, I noted 3 elements that I think are going to be important for the continuation of the conversation. The first one is what Joana, you referred to as bringing out the invisible, you said. The invisible being related to surveillance, to ecology, in apparently unmaterial or badly called unmaterial technologies. The second element in everything you said, Matthew, when you spoke, whether it is an alternative server, browser that you're creating, or producing pieces of software, the idea of reworking, and all of that connected to the digital, not so much as a thing that is in front of you, which is the last thing you were saying, but as in a way, your habitat. So in talking about agency, which is also something you mentioned, like something less passive and more agent, more able, I think reworking this environment, this habitat, this is something that we should demand from digital art practices. And to get further into these three elements, bringing out the invisible, reworking, and then understanding it as a habitat, that you have a say on how it works, and that you can, in a way, either bring to glitching or rework. I would like to talk about a specific project that brought you two together. It was called Carbolithics. It was shown in Basel, which I think is interesting because we're throughout the day also mentioning in which context each things appear. And since we're talking about galleries, this piece by Joana was just now in Art Basel. And Joana, if you can say quite briefly what we're looking at.
Yeah. So indeed, this is what brought us together. I mean, Matthew was a great help, and we collaborated quite well with this. He also wrote a great text for the piece, which is online. So this piece, in a nutshell, basically it quantifies the carbon emission of cookies. So I analyzed together, it's a collab with the Barcelona Supercomputing Center here in Barcelona. So we analyzed all the cookies, the tracking cookies present in the top 1 million websites. We did this analysis at the beginning of 2022, and that's the result. So this is sort of a visualization. We couldn't do it real time because there are just too many cookies that are being activated or created right now around the world, but this is sort of an approximation that allows the browser not to crash. Because if not, it would just last 1 second and everything would crash. But overall, we could identify more than 21 million cookies, which is a lot. And yeah, the carbon emissions were also quite high, even though the number was not big enough as to attract attention, which is quite sad. But yeah, that's in a nutshell, that was this project is about.
And then Matthew was invited to write a text about this.
No, but he also like in advisory, and we discussed a lot of how this could look like and how it was really good. Yeah.
Please, just if you can say a little bit about this collaboration before I'm.
Well, I think it was very casual. It was basically me being annoying to Matthew and asking him a lot of questions.
Yeah. Very good at being annoying.
I think it's interesting to think of how your work affects each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I like about Joana's work is it's very blunt. I think a lot of the time is it's in what I mean by that is that it's as close as possible to a realism that you can get. That is, there is no decorative function. Is an attempt to get at the real, and this is a problem that we have. Philosophically, one could say that finding the right words, finding the right methods, finding the right instruments is a problem of addressing the real in relationship to science. And this, we obviously know that this is the question that goes back to Kant in many ways. But then the question of how one addresses the real in relationship to art is also this question of how do you make an index of something that's happening that is exceedingly complex, that involves millions of entities or billions of entities per second, and that is having a dynamic effect on the world. So if we think about some of the artworks that have been shown today, extremely good artworks that show vast amounts of information being processed on screens. There are other aspects of digital culture that are vast amounts of information being processed in a distributed fashion throughout multiple sites, so tens of thousands or millions of sites, which produce this kind of dense texturing of digital culture and the formation of lived experience through algorithmic processes that are not only simply aesthetically known to humans, but that also have direct ecological effects in terms of their energy requirements. So this project seems to me to be something that allows for some kind of address of the complexity of these systems that we inhabit, and to allow us not simply to receive them as users that have ease of access to a certain very constrained grammar of action, or that construct us as kind of awed and excited, thrilled viewers of a spectacle, but that engage us in these calculational processes, the kind of the way in which computing is constituting an additional layer of ecological systems, but that also has its costs in terms of ecological systems. And this project directly shows us how an engagement with thinking about how to reframe global computing systems as something that have an ecological cost seems extremely valuable in terms of thinking through our current experience of the world.
And so this collaboration now is visible in a piece you wrote about that specific work. And for me, something that was outstanding in that piece is that you brought forward two notions. One is that you thought were combining in Joana's work. One was the aesthetics of the expository, and here I believe it connects to what you were just saying about bringing out with no decorative function. And the other one, which is the one I would like to dig deeper on, is the aesthetics of addition. And you describe it in a series of ways, but I really like one of the formulations when you said that the importance of an artwork has to be, and this, I quote you, the irritant and awkward supplement to the enormous power of platforms. Now, could you say a bit more about this idea of addition? Because I believe it is something we should insist on and defend when it comes to digital art.
Well, I think if we think of digital culture as in broad terms, you can think of the kind of digital culture that is addressed to us by Silicon Valley, as the equivalent to the kind of culture that's addressed to us by Hollywood. Now, there's definitely a place for big blockbusters, the spectacular, the monolithic, and so on. But there's also a space within culture for other forms of aesthetic, other forms of aesthetic within film that don't play by the games of the Marvel comic universe as it expands onto the cinema, for instance. So there's a need for art practices that engage at a thick and inquiring level about what are the forms of knowing and experience that digital culture produces, and to engage with them at a tangent from the assumed position of the user. The aesthetics of inquiry is about this kind of question of, or the expository rather, is about this question of investigation. And the last time actually I spoke from this stage was really was during an exhibition by the group Forensic Architecture at MACBA a few years ago, which where we set out this idea of investigative aesthetics, the idea that aesthetics is an expanded field that involves artists, but also architects, programmers, researchers, journalists, to do with how we can make the world, or how we can render the world sensible in some way. So aesthetics, in this sense, has two dimensions. One is as a mode of sensing, that is, of being receptive to the world in various different ways, but also sense making. That is, and that has two elements. One is sense making, as in making sense of reasoning and using kind of intellectual processes to engage with the world, but also of making senses. That is, developing prosthetics. That is, developing new ways of sensing the world. So whether they're art projects that open up our capacity to feel or to understand or perceive or to reason, or just to combine with other species or with other forms of knowing in ways that tell us something about ecological systems, for instance. So that's the expository, in a sense, the investigative. And I think this work does that investigative work by collaboration with the Barcelona Centre for Supercomputing, but also of engaging calculational processes and understanding kind of mathematical processes as forms of inquiry in the world, and understanding things like mathematics as fundamentally aesthetic as well as precise within their own terms. The aesthetics of addition, I would argue, is inherent to digital media, and especially network digital media. If we remember that in the earliest versions of HTML, one of the first tags to be introduced was the embed tag, which meant that you could cite work and you could embed another website or another image or another text within your own page. And this led to the kind of development of copying, plagiarism, piracy, sampling, and so on as fundamental aspects of digital culture, which I think are still the kind of the iterations of it still continue. So this work, in a way, is an aesthetic of addition in that it takes what websites deliver to us, that is cookies, millions of cookies, that require a vast amount of energy usage to be maintained, and adds something to those cookies. What it does is to read them in a different way. So normally we're expected to use cookies, or we're expected to receive cookies, and to take them subliminally. But this work takes them as information, as structuring information for an aesthetic response to the mass overuse of energy by the ad tech industry.
Thank you very much, Joana.
Your question.
Maybe it's like, how do you feel your practice engages with this idea? Okay, like this is my object of study, and I cannot keep it at a distance. There's a moment in which I will have to, in a way, add something to it that modifies that object, and thereby potentially our way of inhabiting the digital. Do you see what I mean? Like, how often, how do we go from critique to interference? How do you take that step as an artist from observing an interface functioning to finding ways into irritating that interface, embedding things within it, producing something different within what you're working with?
Well, that's a good question. Also, lately I've been questioning a lot, like the limits of the screen and showing something in a screen. Because, as I said at the beginning, so the interface, it's the only interface, only agent or whatever object that we have to access all these massive infrastructures and ecosystems that we don't see otherwise, right? And the only access, the internet is probably the biggest infrastructure that has ever been built in the story of humanity. And there's a lot of things that happen there that are just accessible through the interface. So for me, it was quite natural to annoy the interface and to challenge the interface in that way, because it's the only way us users can actually interfere. But at some point, I feel the interface, it's not enough. It doesn't hold all this ecosystem, as I explained at the beginning. If I could here, there is no browser that could support the amount of cookies or to show the amount of cookies that are being created in real time. And that's a problem, because the very medium that we have to understand, to access these ecosystems, are unable to give us a proper response of what this ecosystem is. Yeah, and I think that's very problematic. So lately, also for a new project, which I'm also collaborating with Matthew, I interrogate very much the role of the body in these processes. So for me, in this stage of my career, my work, I think that also interrogating the body, understanding where the body lays between these systems and what all these systems or all these algorithmic processes, these massive infrastructures does us through our bodies, our individual bodies, but also our collective bodies. It's something that I'm starting to explore because I feel that it also acts not just politically, but also emotionally, which is something that we tend to left out of the equation because there is no way that we can approach this or feel this through an interface. You can get annoyed, you can get angry, but still there is something that's more deep that it's not out there. No, you can't connect with it. There is no place for it to escape, or to present itself.
Which connects to your idea of the sensing and the prosthetic, engaging with this dimension too. Maybe I will use the remaining time to talk about this category that we're addressing today, the digital art. And I can't help but doing this from the perspective of someone that is now in Barcelona. A couple of weeks ago, this is a quick anecdote, there was, in Hangar, we had the pleasure of receiving Legacy Russell. We spent a morning together, and at some point I mentioned to her, like, listen, there is a momentum in this city around digital art. By momentum, I mean that there seems to be not only like festivals and spaces where it's shown, but there seems to be a certain imagination of the city that is wired through that, and it will most certainly inform cultural policy making. And funnily enough, she was like, but what is digital art? And it's someone that, wrote a book titled Glitch Feminism, and she's for sure speaking from a cyber feminist perspective. But it was like, but what exactly is that? And this category in my city just now is fully functional, and it's creating a world. And I feel, and maybe that's problematic to say, but it also has to do with finding a way out for art so that it will meet bigger audiences. And at the same time, it will become functional again by, teaming up with the development of technologies to draw the worst scenario. So I look at this category from that specific moment, and that specific geography. And I would like to ask you, if we were to recommend cultural policy makers what they should be paying attention to, at what kind of digital art should be important, what would you recommend?
Better funding, start. That's a hard question.
I think because I will definitely, to look at things we've been saying, I would definitely, if I could use things that we've been talking about, I think the prosthetic element, there is a crisis of imagination very often when you're facing such complex, circumstances, layers of phenomena, So I think I would say that digital art should be a sort of sensing prosthetic that allows you to process, maybe an interface, I don't know. And the other thing that for me is very important, I know I've been insisting on that since we started, is the addition. Is that being critical has to also have a sort of agency, not only, and this is why for me, when you speak about yourself as these were the projects I was engaged to as a researcher and a writer, but by the end of the day, I produced a piece of code, or I, created a new browser. For me, that's hopeful.
Yeah, I think it's a complex thing to think. Okay, how would one address this kind of questions of policy? Because it assumes there is a kind of knowable agent of policy, whereas I think policy is also multifarious, and it exists in many sites within a city. We would say that every person who inhabits the city has a disposition to the city that constitutes it in some way. And a living city is a city that allows for a kind of dynamic reformation of the site of politics and decision and of planning and of imagination within the city. And I think Barcelona is known as somewhere that has done that at different points in its history in different ways. So that's also interesting to think about. Okay, what is the nature of policy when it arises from different historical conditions or different ideas of the nature of the imagination that we can have about cities. So I think that the real question is who is the agent, who is the subject of policy, and to think that through straight away. But then I think to understand digital culture or digital art specifically as that part of digital culture that is self-reflexive and investigates the condition of digital culture more broadly, and uses that reflexivity as a ground for production, is the basis that digital culture and digital art specifically can contribute to a rethinking of the city. And I don't think it necessarily means it's critical in the kind of limited sense of the formation of a difference or of a critique. It can also be immensely productive. I think one of the most ambitious reworkings of a city in the last decade was Pokemon Go, for instance. And that's probably an unexpected position, but I think in terms of taking the way people inhabit the city and reworking it, getting people to walk into places they wouldn't normally walk, mobilizing different generations through a kind of reinterpretation of the city through this kind of mythic space of the Pokemon. I think it was actually a pretty decent piece of work, and it created different ways of inhabiting and walking around the city that you could actually see happening in real time as you walked around. You could tell who was playing Pokemon Go as compared to shopping or just strolling around or whatever people do in the city. So that was interesting, and I think that's maybe a level of ambition that people should aim at, is to kind of completely recode modes of inhabiting the city. And I think the art practices can do that. We've invented new modes of subjectivity in art and poetics over the century. We've invented new capacities of architecture, new aesthetics of architecture. So the ambition should be big. It should be about creating new forms of inhabitation and new forms of production of cities, not simply about creating special zones where you go in to be wowed by an artwork. That's perfectly fine, but it should be about, okay, what is in the 21st century, given that we have this immense capacity of production and synthesis and generativity in digital culture, how can we invent what the city is in ways that if we look at the city of Barcelona, which has invented itself politically, architecturally, in terms of city planning so many times. Yeah. What's the level of ambition that's appropriate to the 21st century? Not don't fall for like a little bit of bread and circuses.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, completely.
Maybe to continue and react on that. This morning, Elvira, when she did her introduction, she said, artists are better equipped. You just said, about the artistic subject as being able to do certain things. And in that sense, going back to the idea of connecting that to the idea of the discipline, of the digital, I would like to maybe conclude with your concept of art as meta-discipline, because I believe that the specific equipment or the specificity of the equipment, the reason why artists would be better equipped is probably because it's very difficult to isolate them in a discipline. I know that Joana feels, although her work clearly deals with the digital, she doesn't feel so comfortable when she's labeled as, or extremely uncomfortable,
Extremely uncomfortable.
when she's labeled as a digital artist, because I guess it kind of amputates her from all other kind of equipment.
And what does it really mean, you know, to
That's
be a
a quite
digital
good question.
artist? It's, well, what does it mean? Because you wouldn't call digital human because we use smartphone, right? It's. I never understood the distinction. Never.
So from your puzzlement, combining it with Matthew's idea of art as a meta-discipline, it would be, I would like to end maybe with this idea. If you could summarize it for us and kind of in a way, I think it would be a good wrap up all of this whole like category crisis and discipline crisis.
Me? Oh, sorry. Easy questions for me.
No, but does it solve something, like from your
Sorry.
discomfort, this notion
Yeah.
of the
No.
art as a meta-discipline, you know?
It does, because it also puts you in a space, but not as a digital artist, as an artist that for me makes total sense. You know, it's also like to work through the cracks and work through other places other than being static, you know. I mean, exhibitions are great, you know, and they do also a lot of things, but just go and walk a little bit deeper. It's something that I try to do, especially when I write reports with Carbolytics. We wrote an extensive report on the findings, and I think that it should inform like advocacy groups, again, politicians, policy making, and for me, like the perspective of Matthew really puts us in that space, which then it becomes a meta discipline, right? That it can affect other layers other than. Yeah. Sorry, that was because I was thinking about something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to defend the notion of digital art as a you know, if we think of the kind of minor art forms of the 20th century, so photography, performance, video, film, all of these are kind of hyphenated modes of art, in a sense. So art that's working through a particular problematic that happens to be realized as a medium or describable as a medium, but also is about kind of working through the questions of a specific historical condition. You know, so I think that as a minor practice, it's something that sits slightly outside of contemporary art and modern art generally. Although I think, you know, the artists that Stephen mentioned this morning, people like Vera Molnar, Manfred Mohr, and so on, worked within the paradigm of modernism, but kind of amplified it in many ways, that allowed the kind of the formula of modernism to unfold in new ways. So taking art and putting it into another context, and art modalities of creation or of speculation, taking it and putting it into a computational form allows art to become something else. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is not that digital art is somehow separate and is a small space away from contemporary art, but the major field of contemporary art is itself in multiple kinds of crises and multiple kinds of transformation, as it should be. You know, the mode of art is changing radically, and the places where art happens is multiplying, not only in terms of global formations, in terms of who's producing it where, but the kinds of people producing art, the kinds of cultures it calls upon. You know, we think of the impact of feminist and decolonial movements on art practice in the present. For instance, we have an enormous proliferation of modalities of culture which go into the contribution of art. So contemporary art itself is in a mode of expansion, and there are kind of revanchist movements within contemporary art that try to stabilize it within certain kinds of terrain. You know, very much within canonical codes, codes in relationship to property, kinds of institution, and so on. The other option is to open up the floodgates and see what comes out. And I think that's the more interesting strategy is to be generous in terms of our definition of what art is, and to explore this moment of art's massive expansion, and massive expansion in terms of audiences, of social forms, of aesthetic structures, and methods. And this seems to be a really a great moment to inhabit, in that art in many ways is out of the control of any singular central mode of description or of historification, and the challenge for institutions is to kind of chase all the exciting stuff that's happening and to provide platforms for it and to develop it and intensify it. And part of that also is, as you say, it's art's relationship to other disciplines, and the way art has the capacity to mobilize and work with and rework and to test the modes of knowledge of other disciplines. So art as meta-discipline is an argument around the way in which, if we think of the art of the 20th century and the mobilization of the gestation of ideas such as the found object and so on, and that was generated in the kind of nominative term of 20th century art through artists like Marcel Duchamp and so on. What we have now is artists are able to address and to claim and to work with and appropriate much more complex objects, not simply simple objects like a urinal or a bottle drying rack, not simply modes of representation as with pop art, but entire systems of work such as the sciences and so on. And I think we're at a very interesting phase where artists are able to appropriate the methods of work, the kinds of subject and object relations that are set up in different kinds of scientific and technical practices, and work with them, test them, push them to extremes, and mobilize them for aesthetic purposes. So I think that that's in a nutshell the approach of art as metadiscipline, is to push the tendency of art as research and to say, actually, we can flip this and not make art servile to the knowledge forms of the university, but to say, actually, art can appropriate the modes of knowledge of the university and rework it to something more substantial.
Yeah. Maybe on that, we need to open to the public. Anyone has questions, reactions? Yo sigo. ¿Sí? Vale.
Venga.
No. Yo tengo más. Sí.
No one wants to interview. No, I think it's an opportunity also because we have in the context of the galleries on the market, and also the context of the public institution. Two different generations of artists, Matthew and Joana. And maybe it's interesting, something that we make in the 1990s. I don't know, Matthew, you remember this, the Daniel Langlois Foundation, when we made this Preserving New Media in the 90s, 404 meetings about preserving. And it's something that is floating all the time when we are talking in this such kind of project, no? How to preserving, how you see your project in, it was a question all the time on the table, in 20 years, in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. And also because I have a question, because most of the projects that you mentioned, Mongrel, Olia Lialina, Heath Fanti, most of the projects is that they are missing. No one is preserving, so they are a responsibility also, these kind of houses like the museum, Contemporary Art Museum, but also the market had the responsibility not only to commercialize the art pieces, and also it was a question, I don't know, because we were talking in the 90s about maybe our practice was the context of our practice. It was more in the public space. We say informational society is an amplification of the public space at that time, especially in the 1990s. And we saw most of the project like a performance, something that is temporary, happen, and then it's missing. But even performance is something you need to document and preserve. I am talking about responsibility and how you see this, because we saw some example before from the 70s. We have in Spain also, because we have this Centro de Cálculo, and we have especially Sempere, many pieces that happened at that time, operating with computers. And the way of preserving in the Reina Sofia, something is like a classical pieces. We have the painting, and we have just the printing. The printing is interpreting, or we are creating this how to interpret it, no? The protocol that we call the downflabbing protocol, no? How to interpret in a piece in the future. When you have the software, you have the content, we have the machine, we have the machinery and the technical infrastructure.
One.
Well, for me, it's like this question of whether our work should be preserved.
I was sure you were going to say that.
Why? No, because for me, like the way, in my works, and others, it's not something that really worries me, because for me, it's when one of these projects already challenges currently paradigm, and it interrogates it, and it's sort of, even if it's just like a micro shift, but it intervenes in that sense, for me, the work would actually, just implode. And I would be happy. No, in a way that I feel, for me, it's more interesting what this proposes and the paradigms that it can change. That's why I insist on making reports, white papers, and so on, than more than preserving the work itself, because I feel like it's maybe like this accumulation that I'm also fighting, about with a lot of the works that I do, and maybe the artwork should not be just like another accumulation, because okay, like now I'm gonna be honest, even though like I'm working towards, a lot of the materiality of the internet, particularly carbonlytics and the dating brokers are very carbon intensive. It's a lot of megabytes that have to be loaded. Yeah, so I think when it serves a purpose and the work is contemporary and makes sense and it challenges a paradigm and something changes, then for me the work could disappear. It would exist in writings, in books, in publications, but yeah, maybe that's very naive, but that's sort of how I feel.
I think it also connects to something that Matthew was saying, no? Like there are, art has a series of, how would I put it, like core, historical, like core missions or values, and heritage, patrimonialización, preservation is one of them. We currently have a research group in Hangar that is specifically looking at this idea in connection to whether it is sustainable or not, to want to keep everything. Whether it is as within an institution, and so as a patrimonio is heritage, no?
Yeah.
Heritage.
Yep.
Or whether it's just like for artists, like daily life, where do they store their stuff, And it's a huge concern in terms of the practicalities of production, but at a wider scale, it's also in terms of sustainability and ecology. It addresses questions, and I think it's the modern museum. By now, it's the idea that you should be able to keep everything is extremely anguishing.
Yeah.
And so one of the cracks that should maybe find a way to be open would be this sort of comfort with things existing for a bit, leaving certain traces, but not necessarily the thing itself, existing in unmodified forever.
And only say about the formality of the piece, because most of the projects that we are talking, they are like a political interest, also social and cultural interest, and it's not about preserving the thing, but preserving the memory. So preserving in the cultural sense. It's not
That's
like
what
because
Matthew
this
is
meeting we
writing.
make in South Korea, the 404, organized by Langla Foundation and the government before to mounting the memory of Nanjong Peak. And they finally, they buy a factory to reproduce the monitors because the monitor doesn't exist anymore. And after Samsung make a special monitor to make these columns and the whole thing, even then they know that the interpretation of the work can be totally different if the context is changing, no, in a conceptual way of interpreting the thing. But sometimes we are just erasing this moment.
Yeah. I think we should build a culture of erasure, of mourning, of letting go, of and that might involve its inscription, before you let go of something, and maybe it's a technical a report, or but I think it's also urgent to
Let go.
to just let go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way you're asking what are the modes of registration of
Yeah.
of history, in a sense, or when something registers as something that individuates in time or in certain discourses as something of some kind of significance. What is the way it registers, and how does it become memory in a certain way? I think many artists who were active in that kind of net art phase had no expectation that any of their work would be of interest to museums and collectors. This is not to say that they were against the idea, but if you have low expectations of major cultural institutions, generally your expectations will be met quite well. And I think that's part of the story, but also there's a sense in which the construction of canons is from a different media age. It's from the age of print, and it's from the age of television. And there are different canons that are constructed around those periods, and different kind of media forms that produce a form of historification in which we all address our eyeballs to a certain kind of individuals. And you could think, okay, Picasso would be the classic example of a canonized artist who, given a historical change, is now kind of collapsing in a certain kind of way, as a kind of highly privileged figure. But if you have no expectation of being highly privileged in the first place, then the question of entry into museums is almost incidental. If it happens, it's interesting, but it's not a major project. I would say that artists who are primarily focused on entering the canon probably have a problem with their own mortality. And I think that the question is to engage with a more nuanced and relaxed relationship to death. And especially as we're in a society that seems, given its kind of ecological configuration, seems quite interested in death and not able to address it. So I think that's the bigger question. What is memorized? What is historified? How do we construct systems of memory when the canon has collapsed?
And maybe something that should be added to this entire discussion is that, of course, the moment where you are bought is a moment where you are preserved very often. No, you find your collection. If it's public, then so the relationship between memory and market is important too. So in order for preservation not to be so important, maybe you need to make artistic life sustainable before, economically speaking, also, so that operation does not, in a way, does not exist at the crossroads of so many, existentially important things.
I mean, I think there are different registers in which institutions and markets work. So if you take the British pop artist Richard Hamilton, for instance, he's a very interesting artist who I think really nailed some of the aspects of the culture of the 60s in terms of this conjuncture of technology and sexuality and consumption that were being produced at that time. Now, Hamilton also produced, as well as artworks of various different kinds, produced a series of designs for computer systems in collaboration with a computing company who wanted him to make cases for their systems, and also produced hi-fi systems, so concept hi-fi systems that played with two-dimensional, three-dimensional systems. Now his artworks, his artworks are well produced, are well sustained by institutions, but the computer that he produced is one of it's owned by a major UK museum, but they can't touch it because their primary concern with it is with it as an object, and they don't even dare switch it on in case something happens. You know, they don't know what, but something might happen if you switch it on. But his artworks that were produced as commercial goods actually circulate.
Yeah.
So the institution is not the guarantor of memory. It can be the guarantor of a certain kind of repression as well, a certain kind of burying within the archive. And you know, the market in the context of Richard's specific works in relationship to hi-fi systems, to music systems, actually allowed them to proliferate. So that there are not there's not one mechanism that is good and public and one mechanism that's bad and repressive.
The good news is that digital art, performance, all of those that seem more difficult to stabilize and acquire are instruction-based, as it was said earlier today. So that might be also alleviating a little bit of the difficulties. Vale.
Sí. If you allow me.
Sí, por favor.
I think it's already time to move to lunch. Thank you very much, the three of you, for such a compelling conversation. So thank you all for these morning sessions. Y us esperem després, ¿vale? Después del dinar. Y no, los que estáis, bueno, retomamos a las 3:20, ¿vale? We are back at 3:20 after lunch.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.